Hello, gorgeous people, and welcome to the Continuum Approach, my new teaching process for musical instruments. Now, I'm going to try and convince you that the viola is absolutely fantastic, okay? So bear with me, guys. I think we all look at instruments, don't we? And we look at the orchestra and we think, oh, I'd really like to play something, and we kind of have a favourite. And I guess it's maybe based on a visual thing to start with. And then maybe you hear it, you listen to some solo performances, and you begin to bond with the instruments already. Some of us don't do that. Some of us, it's suggested, or maybe somebody donates something to you. Somebody gave me a viola, actually, quite recently, my neighbour. But as a child, I actually didn't want to play the violin. My parents suggested it, and I didn't want to play the violin because I didn't like the way it squished people's necks up. And I mean, this is a very real thing, I was very, very self-conscious, even as a very small child. I'm talking about being a 7-year-old, the way, the violin can squidge up your neck so it looks sometimes like you've got a double chin. I was really aware that I did not want to look like that. It felt odd to watch it. And you should never assume that that's silly if somebody has a silly idea. The cello, you have to have your legs apart. Perhaps somebody wouldn't want to do that. Perhaps somebody would think that was it would make them feel exposed or something. You just, apologies for that in the background, you just can't tell what it is that people are bringing, the sort of the prejudice, if you like, that they've already built up about certain instruments. They may have seen a performer that they really, really like on stage who uses this instrument, perhaps in a band, perhaps it's a bass guitar, and they think, well, I quite like to play double bass now because it's, it's the same sort of feel as a bass guitar. You can't overestimate the impact of this sort of, I guess it's slightly bigoted opinions that people have. And I do regret now not taking up the violin. However, I'm no violinist, and I don't want to be a violinist. And now I'm much older, and I come from playing a cello, and then I went on to viola, because the viola is actually, it's a sort of halfway house between the violin and the cello, if you like. We use a different clef. We use the alto clef, so it's a bit lower than that soprano, and I don't really dig that soprano sound. Right next to my ear. I just I think coming as a cellist into this, you're so enraptured by the depth of the cello and that sort of chocolate velvet, very sensual tones that the cello can make. And suddenly going to a violin, which is really high pitched. And also, we always used to call it the violin. Forgive me if you're a violinist. I do apologise, because, I'm referring to the violin of young children trying to practice. And we all know how awful it sounds when musicians start early and they're playing over and over again, badly normally, they're playing their scales. And, you're talking about 5 years of listening to that. So you've got to appreciate that either the people around you are going to have to suffer, and for your art, it's your art, it's not theirs. But I've got a few ways around that, I'll tell you in a minute. Or, you need not to be ashamed as well. That's another thing. But I always felt that the violin was just an extreme version of that sort of intolerable, high-pitched, eeky, screechy sound, And it certainly put off my other children, because we did try violins with my children, and nobody could stand the sound. It's a bit like a recorder. Very, very much that same kind of shrill pitch that you have to listen to. And once kids start practicing more than half an hour a day, or more than 5 minutes, it really becomes an impactful energy in the house. And that's not always suitable for everybody. So you can't practice in the evening when other kids are in bed. You can't practice early in the morning when other kids are in bed. You've got to work all this out. Do you want to practice while everybody's, if you've got a small house? I'm not talking about the West Wing here. I'm talking about a normal home. Do you want to practice, or do you want your partner or your children to practice while you're trying to cook dinner and everyone's screaming for food? And do you know what I mean? You have to take that into account in today's living experiences, yeah? And I think it takes a very patient parent to sort of go through that. And it's the same with adults, I've had boyfriends who've, sat there fiddling around with their guitars, and after a bit you just think, oh my goodness. I had a neighbour once who used to practice above me, and 2 years in, he wasn't improving on his guitar. It was a lead guitar. He wasn't improving. And I just thought, I wouldn't mind the practice if I could hear that he was improving, but he wasn't. So it used to really annoy me, and I wished that he'd move. So you've got to take all these things into account. Now, the viola is a little bit less, I would say, a little bit less of all that shrill speak. Because it's alto and it's a bit lower than the soprano. It is a bit more. It's higher and a little bit more intense, I would say, than the cello, but it also has that velvety feel that the cello has. So it's a really good option if you want something smaller that you don't want to lug around. The cello's quite big. I mean, I'm a double bass player, so for me the cello looks really small now. But it still requires, especially if it's in a hard case, it still requires lugging around. It's still quite heavy. Yes, you can put it on your back, but you need to have a strong back, etc., etc. You need to lug it around. You probably need a car if you're taking, the instrument to school, or you wouldn't want to be you wouldn't be walking on foot with that. It would be really inconvenient. So the viola kind of comes in at something that solves all these problems. It's not too shrill and it's not too big. Orchestras always most orchestras need viola players because not so many people play violas. They've always got loads of violinists, and quite often now cellists as well, because cello's become quite popular, I think. Certainly in my area, along the south coast, lots and lots of cellists. So, my phone's going again, do apologise. So, it's a really good choice on all of those levels. And now let's talk about an electric cello, an electric viola. Now, I play an electric viola now pretty much all the time. I've just had to go on an acoustic viola that somebody gave me, and I find that my technique has now become much more honed in on an electric viola. Now, the problem with that is, if you learn to play on an electric viola and you don't practice on an acoustic very often, you will find that your technique adapts to the electric. It's much less intuitive. You're not dealing with sort of sound, live acoustic sound in this body. You've usually got it plugged in to something, or it's almost silent. Now, that's really, really good for practicing, because the neighbours, they can still hear it. If you've got someone above you or somebody in the house, you can still hear it, but it's so dampened down. And I practice with a mute now as well, so it's not imposing on people. You can do 4 hours if you want, and you're not really imposing on other people's lives. So that's a really good thing. Also, I work with electronica. I'm a composer who works with acoustic and electronic instruments. So for me, it's absolutely spot on, perfect. I can whack that into my DAW, my Logic Pro, etc. So I still record it live. I still record my instruments live, but they're turned into a MIDI signal, which goes into my computer, and then I can add all of the reverb and the after effects, and I can actually turn it into any instrument I want with those MIDI notes. So, I can even turn it into a drum track if I want, which is really, really good for me, because I'm pretty much into experimental electronics, and that's my bag. I'm not so worried at this stage in my career, and because I'm more focused on acoustic upright bass, I'm not so worried that I'm not getting enough training in on the acoustic viola. It doesn't really bother me. That might change in the future. I've no idea, but we do what we're good at when we're good at it, and we fit it in with our sort of career plans. So I would actually recommend, if you've got a household that's quite close-knit and it's going to be difficult for you to practice for all of those reasons I've just told you about, I would recommend that you get an electric viola. But if you want to play in an orchestra, you will need some practice on the acoustic instrument as well. You'll need to do both. I'm not going to say whether you should do half and half. It depends what your commitments are. If you're going to an orchestra with your viola, you're practicing for 2 hours rehearsals a week anyway, probably. So that's quite a good start. But if you sort of did, quarter of an hour a day of your practice was, on the acoustic and then the rest you did on the electric, I think that would be absolutely fine. The other thing with the electric is I use a synthetic vegan bow, and it's just preferable for me on the electric viola strings. I don't know why. It's synthetic, so it holds differently. You need more rosin with it. It doesn't sound so great on the acoustic, so I'd probably go for a horsehair bow for the acoustic, if I was in an orchestra, say. But for me, the vegan bows, and I use one on my cello as well, my electric cello, absolutely love them. I've just got so used to them now. They're carbon and synthetic hair, and they're very robust. I haven't actually sat on one, but they're very hard to break, which is really good if you're someone like me who's really, really clumsy, terribly clumsy. I'm always breaking wooden bows, and it's heartbreaking. I do use quite an expensive bow, horsehair bow on my double bass, though. And that's an acoustic double bass. I do have an electric, which is great for pizzicato. That's plucking the string, but it's really not very good for bowing, I don't find. So, all of these little foibles are kind of, really they're down to your personality and your personal choices about what you want out of this instrument. I mean, if you're doing something purely for your fun, your pleasure, or perhaps you'd quite like to compose, which is really, where the continuum approach of music focuses heavily on composing, even for very young children. It's part of the physicality of playing the instrument. We believe that it should start at day one. And if that's what you want to do, you'd be fine with an electric. Absolutely fine with it. It's absolutely perfect. We live in a world where most music is listened to digitally. Most music at some point becomes a digital thing. Even an orchestra, when it's recorded, now becomes a digital thing. So working with digitalia, I don't think is problematic if that's what you've got in mind. If you want to be in an ensemble, you need to think differently about, how you're going to progress and what you're going to practice on. Can you do everything? Yes, you can do it all. Of course you can do it all. You learn, different methods. And I would consider actually that my acoustic bass and my electric bass are completely different instruments. I wouldn't say that they are the same instrument. And similarly, I think with the viola, to a degree, not quite as much, and I think if you have that attitude, then you're not going to sit down and play your acoustic and think, well, why isn't it doing all the things that my electric does? That's not going to happen. And vice versa. You're going to have to work differently with the live event of playing an acoustic viola with, all the sound. The other thing that I always find really surprising when I play my acoustic viola is that it's so loud because it's right by my ear. It's incredibly loud. When you play a cello, the sound is coming out below you, quite far, nearer sort of between you and the ground. So it's not right in your ear. But when you play the viola, it is just there, it's absolutely there. And I always find that quite shocking. Even though I'm a double bass player, it's weird. I just think, God, that's so loud right in my ear. So that's something to think about. If you don't think you'd like that, you might want to think about that too. Anyway, I'm broadcasting all day about the viola, so we'll talk about tuning and we'll talk about strings and we'll talk about idiosyncrasies in the next few broadcasts. So do join me today. And happy Christmas, Happy New Year.